There's some emerging data when we're talking about psychiatric illnesses, specifically things like bipolar and PTSD. The mechanisms that we're tapping to here is that MAOA inhibition that we talked about. There is also a thought that nitric oxide might play a role here. So there is a theory that depression, anxiety, and certain mood disorders may be secondary to a dysfunctional nitric oxide guanylate cyclase pathway. And so the thought is, if you are able to address that with methylene blue, you can improve these mood disorders, depression, and anxiety. And the third hypothesis is, again, with the electron transport chain. There's some thought that if you have a dysfunctional electron transport chain, that can lead to some of these psychiatric illnesses, and that methylene blue, given its properties for electron transport carrier in the chain, can help improve it. And again, it's possible. We talked about this in part 1. Methylene blue served as basically the basis of some of these phenothiazine antidepressant medications, such as tricyclic antidepressants. So it's very plausible that methylene blue can treat some of these conditions, and that's why we're doing this emerging research. Welcome to No Filter Doctor, where we cut through the health hype, dig into what's real, what's backed by evidence, and what works. I'm your host, Dr. AK. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome back. We are getting into part 2 of methylene blue this week. I hope you enjoyed part 1 and you understand all of the things that we talked about. I know we got a little deep in some of the biochemistry and mechanisms, but it had to be done because this week we're going to talk about some of the emerging uses that are out there for methylene blue, and then some of these claims that we hear online about their use. There's all kinds of different research that's going on right now regarding the use of methylene blue in different conditions. So let's look at those first and review some of the evidence in that, and then we'll move on to those wellness claims. One of the biggest areas of emerging research are in neurodegenerative conditions, things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, frontotemporal dementia, and other kinds of conditions where you have the accumulation of tau protein. We talked about how methylene blue can prevent tau protein aggregation, but there's also other mechanisms that are tapped into for this research. Some of that antioxidant and anti-inflammation activity, some of the electron transport chain activity. So the thought is, let's look at methylene blue in these conditions. And the one with the greatest amount of research is Alzheimer's dementia. Now, there's a lot of stuff here, and I'm just going to be completely transparent with all of you that I have notes, and I am going to be referring to my notes. Typically, I'm looking at you, but there's just too much stuff when it comes to this emerging research. So forgive me as my eyeballs move to the side and then I come back and look at you again. There was a small phase 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that evaluated oral methylene blue at 282 milligrams a day in 42 participants. Now, 16 of them were healthy, 17 were adults with mild cognitive impairment, and 9 were patients who were diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's dementia. And what they wanted to look for was cerebral blood flow and cognition. Does methylene blue do anything to improve those? And what they found was there was an increase in cerebral blood flow, but there was no difference in cognition. There were some validated tests that they did before and after methylene blue, and they found while, yes, the functional MRI did show increased blood flow into certain areas of the brain, the cognitive tests didn't demonstrate any difference. The results were actually never published in a peer-reviewed journal. In order to access these results, you had to go onto clinicaltrials.gov. Now, that's a website where a lot of these different companies who want to study different things, a lot of times pharmaceuticals and their effects in a clinical setting, will go and register these things on clinicaltrial.gov. It's kind of a way of saying like, no, this is mine. I've already registered this. You can't study this. It's like announcing it to everyone that you were the first one to come up with the idea. It's also something that's used to track the progress of grants. So certain people get NIH money to do research and things like that, and oftentimes they'll register all these studies with clinicaltrials.gov. This study in particular never had the results published for peer review in any journal articles. So you got to go onto that website to see it. And there is a link to the actual study in the blog. There were a couple other small studies that came out by a company called Tau RX. Now, they took methylene blue and they prototyped this synthetic form of the leucomethylene blue part of that. It was like their patented agent that they made, and they wanted to see, what does this do with Alzheimer's dementia? They had a randomized controlled double-blind phase 3 trial where, again, they were looking at this stabilized form of leucomethylene blue. And they evaluated 891 patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. And they demonstrated no significant benefit whenever they compared it to control groups in cognitive or functional decline. What they did do, however, is they went back and they did a post hoc analysis. And we've talked about the purpose of a post hoc analysis. If you go back to other podcasts where we talked about clinical research and how to approach these things, oftentimes, people will do studies. They'll have what their primary endpoint is of that study. They go through the whole process, they do the whole study, and they see whatever it is that was their hypothesis ended up not being true. So then they'll go back and they'll do this secondary analysis of different people who participated to try and find something to come out of all of this data. So that's what they did in this study. They went back and they did a post hoc analysis, and they suggested that there was a possible reduction in the rate of brain atrophy and cognitive decline in a very small group of people who were not randomized, who had methylene blue monotherapy. So some of the people who were in the study were on medications for dementia, whatever those were. There's a couple that are out there. And they're saying that, well, if you look at the people who weren't on those medications and took just methylene blue, maybe you will see some decrease in atrophy, which is kind of shrinkage of the brain, and functional decline. Again, warning, a post hoc analysis, all it does is generate a hypothesis. Now, an additional study needs to be done on that hypothesis to see whether it's accurate or not. You cannot draw conclusions from that post hoc analysis. Tau RX also studied their proprietary leucomethylene blue in patients with frontotemporal dementia. However, I couldn't find this study, so the results are not posted on clinicaltrial.gov. I had to go through and read a bunch of review articles. It seems like the results of this study were presented at a conference. And then a couple review articles summarized the results of this study. And the end result was that methylene blue did nothing to improve frontotemporal dementia. But I can't give you the details of what the doses were or how many people they used in this trial, what was the control group. I don't know any of that stuff. So everything that I found from this was from a couple review articles that talked about the conference presentation from Tau RX. When it comes to Parkinson's disease, so far, there are some promising rodent studies, but we don't have anything in humans yet. We also don't have anything on Huntington's disease, ALS, and several other neurodegenerative diseases in humans. So right now, in terms of what we can conclude from the available data, is that methylene blue does not appear to have any clinically positive effect in the neurodegenerative diseases in which it has been studied in humans. There are still other trials that are underway, and we'll see what the results of them are. The next area that overlaps a tiny bit with Alzheimer's is cognitive enhancement. Rather than the base mechanism be on tau protein aggregation, this is tapping more into the electron transport chain utilization, the oxygen utilization, and anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects of methylene blue. So there was a randomized controlled double-blind trial that was done in 2016. There's also placebo-controlled. And this study evaluated 280 milligrams of methylene blue oral in 26 healthy volunteers. And this study found there is increased cerebral blood flow and improve memory retrieval. However, a more recent study that was done in humans and another trial done in rodents showed the exact opposite effect. There was decreased cerebral blood flow and oxygen extraction at doses as low as 0.5 milligrams per kilogram IV. The authors said, hey, maybe this is that hormetic dose response. Maybe this dose is too high, and that's why we're not seeing these positive effects, which is possible. But another study that was published in 2024 showed the same exact thing. So once again, we have that biological plausibility. We have these mechanisms that we know methylene blue is capable of. But when we did it in a clinical trial, we did not see that outcome that we were expecting. There's some emerging data when we're talking about psychiatric illnesses, specifically things like bipolar and PTSD. The mechanisms that we're tapping to here is that MAOA inhibition that we talked about. There's also a thought that nitric oxide might play a role here. There is a theory that depression, anxiety, and certain mood disorders may be secondary to a dysfunctional nitric oxide guanylate cyclase pathway. And so the thought is, if you are able to address that with methylene blue, you can improve these mood disorders, depression, and anxiety. And the third hypothesis is, again, with the electron transport chain. There's some thought that if you have a dysfunctional electron transport chain, that can lead to some of these psychiatric illnesses, and that methylene blue, given its properties for electron transport carrier in the chain, can help improve it. We talked about this in part 1. Methylene blue served as basically the basis of some of these phenothiazine antidepressant medications, such as tricyclic antidepressants. So it's very plausible that methylene blue can treat some of these conditions, and that's why we're doing this emerging research. Now, some of the studies here are from far back as the 1980s. There were 2 studies that looked at people with bipolar disorder who had the prominence of depression. And they found patients who were treated with methylene blue did have some improvement of their symptoms in the subset of patients who have been resistant to treatment with other modalities. In 2017, there was a double-blind crossover randomized controlled trial demonstrating 195 milligrams a day of methylene blue improved depressive symptoms, reduced anxiety, and did not induce mania in patients with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And that's kind of a big deal. When we're talking about bipolar disorder, the easiest way for me to explain it is the highs are really high and the lows are really low. So people can have very severe depression, but then they can go into these manic modes where they're not sleeping, spending a lot of money, speaking really quickly. And the concern with treatments for bipolar disorder is if you treat one side of that, are you going to make the other side of it worse? So this 2017 study showed that you can use methylene blue to treat these depressive symptoms in bipolar disorder without inducing mania. It's important to note, though, there are no clinical trials that look at methylene blue and just depression alone. So these are studies in patients specifically with the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Now, the PTSD literature, it focuses on something called fear extinction. One theory is that people who have PTSD kind of have a failure of this mechanism. Most of us will experience some kind of event. It's a dangerous event. You go into this hypervigilance, but then your brain can tell you, hey, that event is over. You can now relax and move on. The thought is in patients with PTSD, this click of, hey, the event is over, you can move on, never happens. So they end up living in this state of hypervigilance and can often get triggered back into that same moment when they experience the initial event. So there's been a lot of studies that are done on fear extinction. Can you help patients with PTSD treat this malfunctioning fear extinction mechanism? A 2014 trial did that, but also used methylene blue. And what they found was people who underwent successful fear extinction therapy and were given methylene blue had improved retention, meaning that it helped that PTSD. They didn't trigger and go back into it. But the study also showed the flip of that. Whenever people didn't have successful fear extinction therapy and they were given methylene blue, it made things worse. So the thought was that if you are giving methylene blue, people are going to tap into whatever that last memory was during therapy. So the hypothesis that came out of that study was that methylene blue will strengthen whichever memory is active during the time of its administration. A 2017 study also looked at methylene blue with fear extinction, and they found that you need to be careful when you draw conclusions about what methylene blue does, because in their study, they found this delayed onset. So they gave them methylene blue, saw nothing, saw nothing, saw nothing, and then all of a sudden, they saw that the fear extinction therapy did have a positive effect and improved the PTSD. So the conclusion I draw from all of this is that in refractory cases of bipolar disorder, sounds like methylene blue could be a viable option based on the teeny tiny studies that we have available, and it has some promising findings when we're talking about PTSD. We just have to be careful because these studies are really small, and we've talked about small studies before. The smaller your study, the easier it is to demonstrate a statistically significant finding in the data. Now, there are plenty of FDA-approved medications to treat some of these different conditions, so I think we have to weigh safety concerns, but it could be a legitimate option in some of the refractory cases. In terms of depression alone, we have no data. So we can't draw any conclusions in terms of depression alone. Another area of emerging research is cancer therapy. Now, one of the mechanisms we talked about that photodynamic property of methylene blue, its ability to create that singlet oxygen molecule under certain wavelengths of light. But methylene blue may also be able to reverse something called the Warburg effect that happens in cancer cells. So let me explain this to you. Cancer cells tend to produce ATP through the process of glycolysis rather than oxidative phosphorylation, even in the presence of oxygen. This is an extremely inefficient way to produce ATP. However, it generates all kinds of metabolic intermediates that can be used to allow the cancer cell to replicate. So the theory is if you can reverse that process, then you're going to inhibit that cancer cell from replicating. I'm excited about this area of emerging research. But right now, all of the data is coming from cell culture studies and animal studies. So it's all preclinical. There are no human studies. And the reason is because the delivery of the methylene blue is a little bit challenging in this situation. Methylene blue is pretty rapidly cleared from the plasma. It's also really poor at targeting specific tissues like tumors. So the current research is actually focusing on nanoparticle delivery systems. Can we develop some kind of system that we can package the methylene blue into and then target those tumor cells? The methylene blue can then accumulate there and prevent the cancer from replicating. With photodynamic activation, you can then actually kill the cancer cells. Very exciting field. I'm very much eagerly anticipating what the research shows with this one, because I think, if you can develop the proper delivery technology, then it's going to be worth studying. That's exciting. But we need way more research before we can say it's actually a viable treatment for cancer in humans. Another area that's using those photodynamic properties for emerging research is actually antimicrobial therapy. You can activate methylene blue with wavelengths of light between 630 and 680 nanometers. This leads to the production of that singlet oxygen molecule that we were talking about. Well, it just so happens that singlet oxygen molecule can kill bacteria. And this is completely independent of any of the pathways that traditional antimicrobials use. So in those settings where you have bacteria that have antimicrobial resistance, this is a really promising therapy. You can use it in methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, so MRSA, certain kinds of E. coli bacteria, in addition to another bacteria called Pseudomonas. Most of the studies that have been done are on the topical use of methylene blue, so wound care, skin infections, things like that. There haven't been any studies yet that look at the systemic use, like the IV use of methylene blue as a medication or the oral use. And the reason why is the doses that are required in order to have this antibacterial effect exceed the toxic limits of humans. So we can't really give a medication that's going to kill bacteria if it also kills the humans that are infected by that bacteria. So for topical infections, it sounds like methylene blue is a very viable option and supported by studies. It's used in some case studies and some clinical models. There are certain dressings that are impregnated with methylene blue, and it works. Not there yet for any kind of oral or systemic use of methylene blue because the doses are just going to be way too high. Now, the last area in terms of emerging uses seems so obvious. It's for primary mitochondrial disorders. We talked about the electron transport chain, right? It is in your mitochondria. And so one would think that if you have a mitochondrial disorder, giving methylene blue will help that because it can accept the electrons from NADH and deliver it down the rest of the chain, bypassing other things. Unfortunately, there are literally no clinical trials on using methylene blue in any of these patient populations. There was a cell culture study of fibroblasts with Leigh syndrome characteristics. It was from 2011, and it demonstrated the restoration of ATP along with improved cell survival. And that's kind of it. There's several reasons why these human trials do not exist. One, primary mitochondrial disorders are actually quite rare. So it's hard to find enough patients to power studies to see does it make any difference. The other reason has to do with something called genetic heterogeneity. So we have those 4 complexes and ATP synthase in that electron transport chain. People who have primary mitochondrial dysfunction can have it from any number of genetic variations that cause the dysfunction of those different complexes. So what you don't have is this one dysfunction in this one complex causes this one mitochondrial disease. It's usually some kind of overlap of dysfunction between different complexes, and those complexes are going to be different. So people can carry the same diagnosis of primary mitochondrial disease, but it's from a variety of different mutations in those complexes. You can't really predict how methylene blue is going to behave in that population. Can you help some people depending on which complexes are involved? Yeah, totally. But then you can cause a lot of harm in people depending on which complexes are involved. You also have the hormetic dosing response to worry about. So you have this compromised mitochondria, then you're going to give a medication that can actually take out other parts of that electron transport chain that are actually working based on the dosing. And the dosing can be really challenging. We talked about this last week. The cell culture and animal study culture said somewhere around 2 milligrams per kilogram IV, but there were some studies that showed this hormetic response as low as 0.5 milligrams per kilogram IV. So biologically, for those 2 reasons, it's really hard to study methylene blue. And then the last part is the one that actually upsets me a little bit. Methylene blue is a generic off-patent compound, and there is little commercial incentive to study it in these really rare diseases. Companies do not want to invest all of the money that is going to be required in this rare population of individual because they are not going to recover the losses of what they spent in the research. And that personally is upsetting to me, but that is what we deal with when we talk about big pharma and money and for-profit entities. So for all of those reasons, in the one area where it would probably make the most amount of sense to use methylene blue, we are not studying the use of methylene blue. All right, let's get into some fact-checking some of the wellness claims now. It boosts mitochondria. Okay, we talked about that electron transport chain last week. We know that methylene blue can bypass part of the electron transport chain, but methylene blue actually yields less ATP than your normal functioning mitochondria would produce. That's because under normal circumstances, you get 16 hydrogen ions pumped into that intermembranous space that is then used to power ATP synthase. When we use methylene blue, we have 4. So you have much less hydrogen driving the production of ATP through that ATP synthase. So it does not boost mitochondria. If anything, it causes the mitochondria to produce less ATP than it would outside of methylene blue. There is literally no documented human evidence that a healthy mitochondria benefits whatsoever from methylene blue. Next, it increases daily energy. It is very possible that people take methylene blue and they feel more focused, more energetic, and less fatigued. The major problem is there's no way to prove that methylene blue is what's causing them to feel that way. Are there mechanistic properties that you could explain from a theoretical standpoint that could have these effects? Yes, 100%. But a proposed mechanism is not a clinical result. We talked about that in the neurodegenerative research so far. The proposed mechanism is decreased tau accumulation. However, in the clinical trials, we saw no difference in clinical effect. There are multiple reasons why people experience low energy, and some of those we can test for. A perfect example is hypothyroidism, right? Somebody comes in, they give me all these different complaints, and I'm like, that sounds like this could be due to hypothyroidism. I can check labs. I can check their T4, I can check their TSH, and then I can make a diagnosis of hypothyroidism. I can then prescribe medications and then recheck labs for effect. We cannot do that with methylene blue. There's nothing to measure a before and after in terms of administration of methylene blue to see is there any change in effect. The other issue is there are so many different variables that contribute to things like low energy. It could be diet. It could be lack of exercise. It could be depression. Some of these other things that I admit we don't have biomarkers for. So what adds to the difficulty is when you don't have a clinical trial, you have no idea which variable is causing this improvement. So we have no biomarkers and we have no studies that can control for the other confounding variables. There's no way to say that this improved feeling that people have with methylene blue is not placebo. And we've talked about how powerful placebo can be in terms of its effect and influences on how people feel. Number 3. It clears brain fog and chronic fatigue. Again, the mechanistic data is very compelling, but I already went through the emerging areas of research, and we don't have convincing data in those studies to say that it does any of this. If anything, there's some conflicting reports on what methylene blue does with cognition and brain fog. I did a brief PubMed search where I put in mesh terms brain fog and methylene blue. I then filtered for either a randomized control trial or meta-analysis, and I found absolutely nothing. ClinicalTrials.gov had one registered study in 2017 and no results, no follow-up, or any other data that I could use to say, hey, could this be useful or not? So again, there's no studies, there's no data, and there's no biomarker to say that it's actually methylene blue. The next claim. Methylene blue is an anti-aging compound and can increase your lifespan. We have once again tapped into all of the mechanistic and theoretical data that's out there in preclinical studies that have been done on methylene blue, and we have made this leap to use it in humans for this. There are literally no studies in healthy humans that show methylene blue does any of these things. And the last one is that methylene blue is a powerful compound for biohacking. I think I need to write a separate blog in the future on biohacking. Until then, I will simply say that almost all of the data that is used for biohacking comes from preclinical studies. It's all from cell culture and animal studies. I tried to find studies about methylene blue improving exercise performance and recovery in humans. I found none. I did find a study from 1986 that was done in dogs. They gave them 4 milligrams per kilogram of IV methylene blue, which we know to be higher than the 2 milligrams per kilogram IV that we've talked about. And with that dose, it showed no change in cardiac output or oxygen consumption. There was some evidence of improved NADH oxidation, and that's it. So the bottom line is we have no human clinical evidence that methylene blue can be used as a biohacking compound. With each one of these claims, you have one common theme. Methylene blue can do this in a cell. So let's jump from that and use it now in a healthy human being for all of these listed reasons that we have found it does something in a cell culture study. It's a huge leap, and there is zero evidence to support any of those uses. The fact is, there is a huge gap between the wellness claim uses of methylene blue and the actual medical uses of methylene blue. The first one is duration. In all of these different medical uses that I listed earlier, methylene blue is used for this short duration of time to address whatever that underlying condition is, and then it's no longer given. We have zero data on daily use, long-term use, or chronic use of methylene blue, so we don't even know what the safety data shows about that. The next is we are leaping from a disease to human optimization. Everything we do in medicine has some kind of risk-benefit calculation, right? If someone is dying from septic shock or post-cardiac surgery vasodilatory shock, the risks that are associated with methylene blue are on par with the risk of not using the medication, which is death. You're going to take the chances of the risk because the person is so sick and so severe and the outcomes are so bad that it's worth taking the risk. However, if you have someone who is completely healthy, is it worth the risk of that toxicity or interaction with other medications or unmasking G6PD deficiency because you now have hemolytic anemia because you use methylene blue? You can't chase after these theoretical benefits in a healthy human and ignore all of these known risks. It's not the same risk-benefit equation. We also have no way of identifying who in that healthy population could even benefit because, again, we have no biomarkers. So it's not like you can get a lab test for some kind of condition and say, you know what, methylene blue will help with this. Let me give it to you. Let me retest it. We have that in medicine, in septic shock, in post-cardiac shock. You give the methylene blue, blood pressure improves. You have some kind of objective biomarker or data point that you can use. And the last gap that comes up repeatedly when we're talking about any kind of supplement is this leap from a mechanism, a theory and a hypothesis based on a cell culture or animal study, and then leaping to use in human beings. When we talked about peptides, we talked about the fact that different compounds come up all the time, and pharmaceutical companies are so excited to test them because they want to make money off of it. But 80% of the time, things don't pan out. Even though there is this mechanistic theory, the clinical outcomes don't show any benefit, and then that agent gets dropped by the pharmaceutical company. Just based on those statistics alone, chances are that it's going to be the same case with methylene blue. We've looked at some of the studies that are out there, and maybe a handful show some kind of positive response, but the majority of them showed no change in clinical outcomes. So I don't know why we think it's going to be any different with these wellness claims when in emerging research that we're trying to do to use methylene blue, there is no difference. Why would it be any different for these wellness claims? One other thing that I think is exceedingly important to discuss is the source of the methylene blue. In the medical setting, methylene blue is coming from pharmaceutical companies that are making it. In the wellness setting, that is not the case. Methylene blue is coming from compounding pharmacies, from aquarium supply stores, from industrial dye sources. Methylene blue is not this like super safe compound that you can just take and everything will be great. We've talked about it can be toxic. It can have a lot of different adverse effects. And when you are getting methylene blue from these outside sources, you cannot trust what is the concentration of it, what is the purity of it, what kind of safety standards were used in the manufacturing of it. Getting methylene blue from a regulated medical supply chain versus from any of these other sources is night and day. This is a legitimate safety concern. I am not a hater of methylene blue. I'll be honest with you. After going through all of this data, I think there is some real potential here for the use of methylene blue in different conditions. It's so versatile that I think it would be naive to say like it doesn't do anything to help with some of these different areas where they are doing some research right now. But I say that with a ton of caution. First of all, I want some biomarkers. I'd like to be able to test something before initiating this treatment and then testing it after to evaluate effect. Right now, we don't have any biomarkers, so I'm not like, yeah, methylene blue. We need some biomarkers to make sure that it's actually working. I'm also very cautious about the dose. As little as 0.5 milligrams per kilogram IV have shown some concerns for possible toxicity. So I think we need to kind of iron that out a little bit more and figure out what is a nice safe dose that can be used. We need more studies, my friends. We need more studies on the clinical effects of methylene blue. We need more studies that are going to reveal some biomarkers that can be measured for effect. And we need some more studies that really look at the safety level in people who are healthy to be using this medication. And I think we're going to get there eventually. We're just not there right now. The idea of accidentally poisoning a perfectly functioning electron transport chain in the name of anti-aging, longevity, or any of these other wellness claims blows my mind. We are not ready for the primetime use of methylene blue for every ailment that's out there and every vague complaint that we have. We need more studies. We need more data. I think we're going to get it. And I'm going to continue to follow this because I do think that there is some potential here, and I'm excited to see what that is. I hope all of this helped resolve some of this confusion out there in terms of methylene blue, its safety, its uses, what kind of risks we're taking with it, what are the cases that we can use it in now, and what are some areas that we may be able to use it in the future. The future's bright. I'm excited to see what it shows. And I will talk to you all next week. Take care. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's No Filter Doctor. If you enjoyed the content, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also go to www.thewholehumanhealthandwellbeing.com and sign up for the weekly newsletter where you will get a link to the blog, that week's podcast, and a health tip of the week sent directly to you. It's important to know that while I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only, and it's not intended as medical advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. The information discussed should not be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any medical condition, nor should it replace individualized medical care. If you have questions or concerns about your health, please contact your own healthcare provider. Any decisions to delay or forego a medical evaluation or treatment based on the information discussed in this podcast are made so at your own risk. My only financial disclosure is my medical practice, The Whole Human Health and Wellbeing. Take care, and I'll talk to you next week.